Guys, have you seen my Muftić anywhere? I can't find my Muftić. I've needed my Muftić all day.
Well,
I can't find it.
Is that a thing? Or
do you remember when was the last time you had it?
My Muftić, it's so small, my Muftić. It gets away really easily. Probably fell right out of my pocket. But if you guys see my Muftić.
I'll make sure to hand it over to the closest department of Croatian National Resistance and or Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you.
I guess Muslim Brotherhood because they're still active.
Yes, that'd be better. I'll go there for my Muftić.
And go there and be like, have you seen my Muftić? And they'll be like, what
Yes.
the fuck are you talking about? That was
Where's my
the
Muftić?
50s. 60s. We moved a long way since then.
Well, welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray.
Yo.
Hey,
We're here to talk about the Muftić.
We are.
Back again.
We are, yeah. This is Muftić Part 2. You know, I was just thinking, we're recording this on the 20th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah.
for those of us who remember that well. It's kind of a...
Wait, no, 20 years ago was the Vietnam War.
Yes.
You're confused.
No, the other massive, illegal operation that sent millions of people into absolute misery and destruction for decades. And, showed the failures of the anti-war movement that some people were a part of.
Yeah, really brought the hammer down there.
Yeah.
But you know what else? Speaking of Iraq, our free listeners missed a little Muftić story about Iraq. Maybe we could warm them up, bring them in on that one. If they remember
I don't
Muftić.
know. I might get there. I mean, I guess it's kind of appropriate then that that this episode at least will touch on some of the beginnings of America's modern foreign policy and intelligence involvement in the Middle East and North African affairs.
Oh,
It seems kind of appropriate in some ways.
I'm gonna guess it's completely by the books, not at all related to any Nazis.
No, not at all.
No,
Of course, no.
Damn.
The Nazis never come up on this show. You know better than that, Fritz.
Yes.
Come on. Let's be serious here.
Yeah, I mean, U.S. intelligence would never, though.
No, never.
They're the good guys.
They're the good guys. It gets weird, as you might expect from this show. But yeah, I mean, we are continuing our story. I guess, is this part 2? This is part 2 for the free listeners, but it's part 3
part 2.
for everyone else.
I mean, we got a little bit of the Muftić in the Patreon. It was mostly about the Puharic, the other kind of Croat.
That's true. So I mean, we are continuing on our story of the enigmatic Mahmut Muftic, but kind of like the Patreon episode about his paranormal involvement. We're kind of going to use his case to explore some of the interesting broader history of CIA recruitment of Muslim anti-communists during the Cold War, because it is about Muftic, but it's kind of bigger than that in some ways. He's a good way.
Muftic's life.
That seems to be like. He's a good way about for talking about like other things.
Yeah,
I mean? He writes a book on like Ara, and so we end up talking about some other very, very weird things.
I bet that was true in his life too. Like, I bet whenever he showed up, people were like, "Hey, it's Muftić. Hey, how's your brother-in-law?"
Yeah.
well, I mean, if you're a Muslim fascist, that's already a thing that connects you to lots of stuff, and then it's the Cold War, and you're living in the Middle East, and you're a fake doctor into hypnosis.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I find him to be interesting, because he does exist at this like intersection of so many different Cold War elements, right? I mean, like from the emigrate terrorist organizations that we've been talking about this whole arc to this unexpected side quest of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then
the even more unexpected side quest of MK Ultra.
of MK Ultra. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of weird stuff. And in our episode last week, in our free episode, we discussed how Muftić was frequently accused of working for various intelligence agencies, from the Mossad to British intelligence, which is, what Luburić accused him of, leading all the way up to his mysterious alleged death by poisoning in London in 1971. Uh-huh. We know that he spent the 1950s in various Middle Eastern countries, as we said, doing valuable medical research, such as, doing experiments on Iraqi hospital patients on whether the blood of hypnotized people induces hypnosis into the person that the blood is transfused into.
Without their knowledge, which was really important for the experiment. He was really clear about that. Yes.
And kind of that he couldn't replicate it again if he wanted to, which kind of defeats the purpose of a scientific study, I think.
Also, his results were pretty unrevealing. It was just interesting enough to warrant further research funding.
Yeah.
From the American Institute of Hypnosis, led by Billy Joseph Bryan, Dr. William Joseph Bryan.
Yeah, the MK Ultra guy behind the hypnosis program.
Yeah. /
CIA.
Expert turkey taster.
Yes. This is, of course, a reference to our Patreon episode. So if you think that's interesting, take a look. If
you like turkey.
There's going to be more on that. I think we're going to have 2 more episodes on that, right?
Yeah. You know what? I didn't connect the turkey to, because Ben Franklin was also on that episode somehow that we did it for the patrons. It's also a turkey guy. They're both turkey guys.
They are.
But on just very different sides of the issue of hypnosis, I think.
True.
Yeah.
And so, going back to Muftić, we also know that by the 1960s, he was being sent to meet various representatives of different governments on behalf of the Ustasha movement, as well as acting on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Ramadan as a delegate to the World Muslim Congress. This is all stuff from last week, but, it's good to be reminded of it. We also know that, it was during the 1960s that his primary base of operations would move from the Middle East. I think Gaza was his last place of residence before he moved to Europe. Mm-hmm. But, of course, we said he lived all over, right? Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, you name it. He was there. And specifically, to West Germany, Switzerland, and then eventually the UK. And these destinations for Muftić were, I think, definitely not by chance, as they kind of followed this path of his much more important brother-in-law, Sayyid Ramadan.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So who was the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, right?
One of the high-ranking members, kind of de facto leader in the sense of international involvement, at least. Because at the time that the real leader of Muslim Brotherhood died, was killed, Hassan al-Banna, he was still relatively young, right? So they kind of had him do a lot of things internationally. But, I mean, he was kind of this de facto figurehead for the movement at the time. But in order to understand Ramadan's involvement with the CIA, which is a thing, we need to take a look at some of the other things that were going on at the time and the policies of certain Western governments that made that link between intelligence agencies and organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and Sayyid Ramadan possible. Mm. And for this, we're going to have to take it back a little ways. We're going to have to remind ourselves of certain episodes we did several months ago, I think 140, 142, and 144, about the Gelen organization, Operation Bloodstone, and the Intermarium and the like.
Intermarium too? Are we going to have to deal with the Intermarium?
No, not so much. Okay. Not so
I'm
much
not
the
ready.
Intermarium. We're not actually dealing so much with the Intermarium, but that kind of whole refugee resettlement thing as well. So I don't know, Fritz, maybe you can give us just a quick summary of what went on in those 3 episodes.
Well, Boris, you see, there was this thing called the Nazis, and they had their own intelligence set up during the war, particularly spying on the Soviet Union. Their intelligence, not great. Never really great. But they looked really good, and U.S. intelligence dudes thought these Nazis had all the answers. And so when the war started to turn, Reinhard Gehlen, who was an SD guy, he was also the commander of Ost, of Armies East. He is the, I guess, what's the opposite of a brainchild? Brain daddy.
Brain daddy, okay.
He was the brain daddy of the Vlasov plan, which was, in short, centered around a guy named Vlasov.
I mean, Vlasov commanded the Russian Liberation Army, which was a collaborationist army of Russian ethnic Russians, anti-communists that were, supposed to liberate Russia from Soviet rule.
Yeah, and these guys were led by German intelligence. And and when the war turned against the Nazis' favor, Gehlen wanted out and got in touch with U.S. State Department, I believe, people, and the OSS at the time, saying that I have this vast network. I've got a bunch of intelligence on the Ruskies, and I'd be happy to work for y'all. And so as the OSS becomes the CIA, or rather when the OSS disappears and the CIA becomes, Gehlen is already integrated into the CIA, and his organization becomes, for a while, one of the primary, if not the primary source of Soviet intelligence for the U.S., which was vastly inflated and contradicted kind of everything that agents on the ground knew at the time, which was that the Soviet army was nowhere near poised for some sort of massive invasion of the West, although the Gehlen organization convinced the CIA, who convinced the American government and American people that in fact was the case. And this accelerated the need to step up programs such as Bloodstone, which would take hold, I think, in 49 and 50. Maybe it was like 48 to 51, but it's in that area there, which worked through the Displaced Persons Act at first to bring over other anti-communist exiles, particularly people that were, for instance, ranking officials of some kind, experts of some kind, with a special penchant for war criminality. And that worked sort of on every level. And this was both importing these people into the U.S. and giving them sort of governments in exile, but more than likely think tanks, stuff like that, or national organizations of some sort. A lot of professors and people like that around, a lot of Nazis. And on the other side, you had the sort of stay-behinds that were out there working through things called like the labor services that were attached to larger army programs towards the end of the war, which eventually would get normalized more or less in a new form that we call the special forces. And this is a very short version of a very long story. Yeah. And even our long story version of it is the short story version of it. There's a lot more to do on this. But in short, that's the sum of it.
But the stay-behinds were, for example, recruited from displaced persons that were in, for example, Germany, right after the war. People that found themselves in Germany after the war, much like
it could be, but they could also be nationals that were still there. So, for instance, like the German youth brigades, which we made fun of a lot, were just Nazis in Germany. Right.
Kind of keep that in mind when we talk about some of this stuff that's going on that I'm going to talk about right now. So, similarly, after the war, as events in the Middle East, kind of broadly speaking, I hate the term Middle East and North Africa. It's a loaded term, right? Because we're talking about also, we will be also talking about places that aren't in the Middle East and the like, but kind of broadly speaking, the Middle East and North Africa. As events were transpiring there in the post-war period, especially with the overthrow of many of these monarchist governments in favor of nationalist, like Republican ones, such as Egypt or Yemen or many other cases, as time progresses, the U.S. government was seeking out new allies that would be in line with U.S. interests, And in order to do so, they once again utilized structures that the Nazis had conveniently established for them.
Yeah.
And so, as we've talked about, as Fritz just mentioned, in the immediate period after World War II, Western intelligence services started to, recruit and utilize anti-communist emigres, many of whom were collaborationists or outright Nazis. So it is from there that we get the National Committee for a Free Europe and its kind of sister organization, the National Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism. And
that doesn't sound anti-Semitic at all.
There's a yeah. Well, okay. So the National Committee for the Liberation from Bolshevism went through a number of name changes. They dropped the Bolshevism thing because by the 50s that was already kind of passé and kind of more associated with Nazis and the far right.
Yeah.
To be using the term Bolshevism. They then renamed it to the National Committee.
Guess? Was it the
something democracy? No, there has to be.
Surprisingly, no. Actually,
okay.
Okay. National Committee against financial speculators.
No, this is a U.S.
National
government
Committee
operation,
against Hollywood elite.
Is the word freedom there?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
Well, liberation is there, so it's
Okay.
the National Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia. I mean, these acronyms are starting to sound almost Soviet in how long they go on.
Right.
There's like famous Soviet acronyms. They're like, an entire sentence reduced down to like, 4 letters.
National Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia.
Right. And that was chosen because they didn't want to say USSR because certain emigre organizations didn't recognize the legitimacy of the USSR and considered it a continuation of the Russian Empire, something that is pretty familiar to us these days, actually. And from there, because that's also a fucking mouthful, they changed it to simply National Committee for Liberation.
Oh, okay. Fine. Who's against that? That sure beats National Committee for the Reserfdom of Russia or something.
Yeah. So commonly this is referred to as AmComLib.
AmComLib.
Which is certainly easier than saying the whole name. And so I'll probably call it AmComLib from now on.
Not to be confused with LibCom.
No, not to be confused with LibCom. But yeah, it did actually occur because it has like the ANCOM too, right?
Right.
It has AmCom, which sounds like ANCON.
Yeah.
Which is, unfortunately an internet thing for anarchist communists. I never liked that shortening. I thought it was rather, whatever. But on paper, AmComLib was an NGO registered in the U.S. by concerned citizens who, would pay out of their own wallet to, support the liberation of these poor people behind the Iron Curtain. But in reality, it was completely funded by the CIA. It's a CIA operation. And, this CIA front group had a number of tasks, but broadly stood to organize various national groups from the USSR and, of course, use their disenfranchisement with the Soviet system to promote the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So on the psychological warfare front, AmComLib, and this is what we know it best for today, is for Radio Liberation, also later known as Radio Liberty, which is the counterpart to Radio Free Europe, that I think a lot of our listeners know about, right? Radio Free Europe was directed towards Eastern European countries, so like Warsaw Pact countries, and also CIA, obviously a CIA front organization to promote anti-communist and pro-US propaganda. And these organizations in Radio Liberty too, they employed lots of actual journalists, the people that were running these doing the actual journalism there weren't CIA agents. They were journalists who were working for the CIA, if that makes a difference to you. But it does kind of come up a lot because some of these journalists didn't even know the extent of the CIA's involvement or whatever, but that's who they worked for. But Radio Liberty, on the other hand, was meant was targeted specifically towards the Soviet Union, right? So it was to broadcast within the Soviet Union. They had broadcasting stations in Europe, but also, for example, to reach the Russian Far East, they had broadcasting stations in Taiwan and Japan and the like, right? And, as I said, the goal there was to organize these various national groups. So keeping with that, they had various desks and language sections that would represent different ethnic groups, including, of course, the Soviet Union's many predominantly Muslim ethnic groups in the Caucasus and Central Asia, Tatars and the like. And so they had language desks for all of them. And this is where the Nazis come in. So MCOM-Lib set up its European headquarters in Munich, in Germany, in West Germany, which wasn't by coincidence, of course. Munich was home to many different emigre groups from the Soviet Union, from Eastern Europe. Right, that's where Bandera would end up. Lots of Ukrainians, lots of ex-Vlasov guys.
Yeah.
It was kind of the center in West Germany for refugees from the Soviet Union.
Well, we should also say that Konrad Adenauer, who was the chancellor at the time, was essentially there on the good graces and of like the State Department and shit like that. Gehlen organization people were tied to his campaign and party. The dude was down with the program. Yeah. Right.
But like you said, I mean, the Operation Bloodstone and the like, they were able to. The CIA didn't have a big problem establishing itself with ex-Nazis and with Eastern Europeans, right? And that's partially due to the fact that, the U.S. has massive immigrant communities from the region. So, we talked about this before, the OSS recruited people from, immigrant groups in the U.S., whether, during World War II, we talked about, Serbs who were recruited to go work with the Chetniks and all that kind of stuff. But also a lot of OSS and later CIA guys were, trained in Russian or spoke other East European languages. But they didn't really have that same kind of outreach to Muslim groups in the USSR, right? This was something that they were lacking, but something that the Nazis had developed quite thoroughly, right, and quite well. So now we got to take it back to World War II for just a second. You see, because during the war, the Nazi state established the Reichsministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories.
Oh, tell me it in German, Boris.
No. They do commonly just refer to, I think, what is it, Ostministerium or something. Okay. I don't know. That's not good German pronunciation, but it is typically called the East Ministry, and I will refer to it as East Ministry because, again, saying Reichsministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories is a mouthful. And this was a ministry that was tasked with dealing with the new acquisitions to the east. So in the USSR, which of course included the Caucasus, right? The Germans did manage to push into the Caucasus, and they were planning on, make it all the way to the Urals and beyond. Among other things, one of the primary objectives of the East Ministry was to recruit, of course, from minorities that had some sort of that were disenfranchised, right, by the Soviet Union, to act as kind of a fifth column force for German expansion, much like how Vlasov's army, right, was recruited from Russians. Like it had, Vlasov himself was a Soviet general who flipped sides, but a bulk of their recruitment came from POWs. This is the same thing here. And of course, a lot of guys in Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army were also white Russian emigres who were sympathetic to the Nazi cause. And you actually had some of these people from Muslim minorities in the Soviet Union who had left, during the revolution and stuff, and were in Germany and were supportive of the Nazi cause. So, similarly to, Vlasov's army, the Eastern Ministry organized different quote-unquote volunteer battalions within the Wehrmacht and also the SS, which were, established for primarily Muslims from the Caucasus, although some of their commanders were like Uzbeks and, there was a lot in the mix, but primarily because, German war aims, particularly for that time, were to secure the oil fields in the Caucasus, and they wanted to have a base of support there, right? So this is where you get some of these kind of relatively well-known Wehrmacht and SS detachments, such as like the Turkestan Legion, the Azerbaijani Legion, the Caucasian Mohammedan Legion.
There were even some Kalmyks who are Buddhists from Russia, from Kalmykia, which is in the European part of Russia, who were a part of the Wehrmacht. But I'm not sure if they had their own kind of detachment, but yeah.
Yeah, this is a lot like what we talked about with the Bosnian SS. I mean, these forces, of course, had the blessing of our friend Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which is an important part of establishing these battalions to begin with. But unlike the Bosnian SS, which was its own like autonomous SS unit, which had a lot more kind of control over what they did, even, these were units within different SS units. Like they didn't have it wasn't as autonomous as like the Bosnian SS was, right? Nevertheless, like I said, they had a pretty well-established cadre of anti-communist officers, and then, of course, imams as well, that were, recruited, trained by the Eastern Ministry. Now, the head of the Reich's Eastern Ministry for the Caucasus and for kind of Muslim outreach in general was a fellow that will be important in the Cold War as well, and that's a guy by the name of Gerhard von Mende. Now, Gerhard von Mende was an ethnic German from the Baltics, from Latvia, I believe. Also, actually, the head of the East Ministry in general, Alfred Rosenberg, was also an ethnic German from the Balkans, right? Baltics, Jesus Christ. That's one of the errors that irritates me the most that people make. I just
did it. Well, at least, you did it in a microphone to
however many people listen to the show. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, Gerhard von Mende had an axe to grind with the Soviets. His father was executed by Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution, and his family subsequently fled to Germany. So before the war, he had dedicated himself to the academic study of minorities in the Soviet Union.
Was he advanced later, do you know?
I'm actually not sure. I know he got his PhD in the subject of minorities in the USSR, I think in Breslau, which is now Wrocław in Poland. I do know that he was a Nazi before the war. While he was doing his academic study, like I said, he had a particular axe to grind. And, he, I think, might have coined this term that minorities are the Achilles heel to the Soviet Union. It's the best way to destroy the Soviet Union is going through its minorities and promoting national liberation of all these various different groups, right? And since he was an academic right before the war, he actually had a pretty good working knowledge of several languages. He spoke Russian, he spoke Turkish, and including like other Turkic languages that are related to Turkish, and like Azeri and the like. And I guess also had some knowledge of Arabic. And so that made him pretty uniquely qualified for a particular job when the war came around, right? He's a Nazi, a pre-war Nazi, who knows probably more than anybody else in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany about minorities in the Soviet Union. So of course he gets his position and he does all this work during the war. He makes it out at the end of the war, typical kind of story, ends up not knowing really what to do for a little while in West Germany. But his skills and knowledge were once again put to good use by the West German government, and specifically West German intelligence, the BND, to do what he had done before and organize the anti-communist Muslims who remained in Germany after the war and support, the publication of subversive anti-Soviet propaganda. So this is something that he's very familiar with. And I mean, there were not a huge number of Muslims that were in Germany at the time, but not an insignificant number either. It kind of gets overlooked when people talk about like the post-war period and, you know, displaced persons. Some did get repatriated to the Soviet Union or were, you know, the Soviets got them in Eastern Germany and the like. But actually a lot of the, you know, strong cadre that he had trained, like officers and the like, were made it to West Germany and were there. And the West German government essentially reopened the East Ministry, although by a different name. And he was put in charge of kind of organizing this whole thing.
Okay. Oh, I didn't mention, this is important for listeners that didn't hear that Gehlen episode, that the Gehlen organization became the BND. I suppose that'll be important.
Which is the main German intelligence agency.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's important now because look at who they recruited.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I also found out that Gerhard von Mende was, in fact, in a part of the Wannsee thing. He didn't go to the initial conference, but he did follow up work for Wannsee.
Do you want to just mention what the Wannsee?
Oh, yeah, that's where the final solution came from. That's the...
yes. Actually, I did know that. He was there. Yes.
A lot of those guys ended up working their way into the Gehlen organization after the war. A lot of Wannsee people did.
Yeah, I mean...
Mende has a fun quote. Do you want to hear it?
Yep, go ahead.
With regard to the... I'm not going to do it in German. It's too on the nose. With regard to the question of the Ostland, a precise examination of the population must be carried out beforehand, which should not be called racial inventory, but disguised as hygienic examination and the like, so there's no unrest in the population. There you go. That's his thing.
Oh no, this guy was a big time Nazi. I mean, he came out pretty good considering that Alfred Rosenberg, the guy who was the head of the East Ministry, was, you know, executed for war crimes after the war.
Yeah.
So, you know, all things considered, he came out on top, and he definitely did come out on top because he has a whole new career as a BND West German government agent, you know, important guy. Not surprisingly, though, once he takes on his new role, he quickly comes into contact with AMCOM Lib in the CIA, who, you know, as we said, had established itself in Munich, right? Although his relationship with the Americans is often quite strained, it's actually really interesting how that plays out. And it has a lot to do with the fact that he's, at least by my estimation, probably has a lot to do with the fact that he's still a Nazi. And he really doesn't like giving up any control to the Americans. I mean, we'll get into this in a second, but like he had to really fight the CIA, and because, you know, he saw himself as representing West Germany's interest, right? They had a goal. The goal was, you know, unification and all this kind of stuff. And if the CIA was to in any way get in the way of his plans, he would, you know, counter them in any way possible. So there was actually quite a bit of infighting, right? Nevertheless, almost all of AMCOM Lib's recruits for Muslim outreach were von Mendes guys, trained by the Reichsministry for the East, right? So they managed to poach a lot of these guys pretty early on, and some of them, of course, worked for both, but it gets a little bit more complicated as time goes on. So this kind of interagency pissing contest between the CIA and the BND would continue on since the Germans kept on losing more of these SS Muslims to the CIA. And they decided to try and establish Munich as a headquarters for anti-communist Muslims around the world. And this is, I'm really kind of, this is kind of a short version of this whole tale.
Hey, thank you. Thank you.
But they decided to do this by appointing an Uzbek former SS imam, who was part of one of these, Muslim SS regiments that was fighting on the Eastern Front, to be the kind of Grand Mufti of Germany. They really didn't have necessarily the authority to do that, but they did it anyway.
Sure.
Like the ecclesiastical authority to just appoint him, but that's what they did. And that's a guy by the name of Nureddin Namangani.
Okay.
And the idea was that with Namangani in place as like a loyal asset. He was actually he was captured by the Soviets during the war and spent some time in a gulag. He only actually came back to was released and went to West Germany in like 1953 or something like that. But in the 50s, I think it maybe after Stalin died, when some of these guys got let out. And the plan was to build an Islamic center in Munich that would serve as kind of a base for all these exiled Muslims. So how does Ramadan factor into all of this, right? We see that like both the West Germans and the CIA are kind of vying for control of who's going to propagandize for them among Muslims, in the Soviet Union. But how does Ramadan factor? I mean, he's from Egypt. He's not in any way related. Like I said before, the U.S. government was compelled to try to make new allies in the Muslim world because although they had, AMCOM-Lib had all these guys that they poached from West German intelligence, these ex-SS guys, they had a very limited appeal to Muslims beyond the USSR, right? And weren't particularly taken seriously anywhere else for actually a lot of reasons. One of which is that, for example, some of these imams were kind of appointed by the German state. And again, there's this kind of who has the ecclesiastical authority to name these people like imams and stuff. Or did they go through the proper training? All this kind of stuff that if you're, serious about this kind of stuff makes a difference. We talked about this with some of the Orthodox churches as well. Like if you're not ordained by a particular recognized authority, who the fuck are you?
Yeah. The line is everything. Yeah.
Right. And of course, the idea that somehow that they were going to incite a rebellion in Muslim provinces in the USSR started to become less and less likely as, the 1950s went on. I mean, there were guys in AMCOM-Lib who were very much in support of, recruiting all these SS guys, dropping them behind enemy lines, getting things started in a very real way. But again, as the 50s go on, that starts to be less and less likely and relevant. And of course, you have a whole lot of other things happening in the Muslim world, right? You have decolonization happening, throughout Muslim countries in North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa with large Muslim populations as well. You have, Indonesia, India, Pakistan. You have all this other stuff. And the CIA effectively didn't really have a good way to communicate with them. And so Ramadan, becomes appealing as a guy who is in a very high position in one of the most powerful rising forces in the Muslim world. We said before, Ramadan, although being from Egypt, also spent quite a lot of time elsewhere, right? He spent some time in Pakistan after the separation of India and Pakistan, working for the Pakistani government, and kind of helping them develop an Islamic ideology behind the state. He was very instrumental in a lot of places. The World Muslim Congress, of course, is something that attracted the attention of the CIA, particularly because of their anti-communist credentials, right? The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, being involved with the World Muslim Congress wasn't necessarily a good look in terms of America's public image because he had been, an outright collaboration with the Nazis, but Saeed Ramadan wasn't really tainted by that. Now they did have some, problems with his, let's say, anti-Zionist sentiment. And, the fact that he was, in a major organization with the Grand Mufti, of course, didn't necessarily look good, but this was somebody that they figured would actually be perfect for, and as an asset, as an outreach to the Muslim world. And because the Muslim Brotherhood was a force that, much like what Muftić said, what we talked about in the last episode, they could say, oh, this is a serious, clerical organization that is very modern, that is anti-communist and anti-colonial in the way that we want them to be, because a lot of what American foreign policy was struggling with at the time was trying to steer the anti-colonial debate towards in an anti-communist direction.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. Right.
And the Muslim Brotherhood is actually perfect for that, right? That's what they were doing. They were anti-colonial, but in a very anti-communist way. So, they had conveniently the same enemies, right? And the CIA's own relationship with Ramadan is also quite complex. It's something that, we don't really have time to get into so much. But definitely during the 1950s and 60s, this relationship was quite strong. And so, he kind of first appears in a kind of U.S. intelligence context at this Islamic colloquium that I mentioned last week, right? That was in the early 50s in the U.S. It was kind of one of the first major Islamic conferences in the U.S., which involved a lot of different universities, particularly Princeton, but also had a significant amount of U.S. intelligence funding as well. Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned last week, some of the guys...
Sorry, this is open funding, or this was like black funding?
I believe that part was black funding.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it was this major conference. And like I said last week, some of the guys that we talked about, like these former SS imams, Bosnian SS imams that went on to start, the Islamic Center of Greater Chicago, Said Kadic and Kamil Avdic were also part of this conference. This is when Eisenhower decides to kind of throw his weight behind Muslims in general, and appeared at the conference, took a picture with them, with Saeed Ramadan. He's in this photo, President Eisenhower at in the Oval Office. And so this is when he starts, like in the early 50s, to have these contacts. Now he's of course bouncing around. Oh, and also this is when he met with acted on behalf of Croatian National Resistance and met their leader in the U.S., Rudolf Erić. Just so that we were reminded that he did also do Ustaša stuff, which is rather surprising.
A couple hats.
But, Ramadan would start to have his own major problems at home, right? Namely, Nasser's rise to power, which outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood and forced, killed al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and forced most of their leadership abroad. Now, Ramadan, like Muftić, did do a whole lot of bouncing around in this time period. And so, in the mid-50s, he actually served in the Jordanian embassy. I mentioned his connection to Jordan last episode. Remember that he's probably responsible for Muftić having an in with the Jordanian government to recognize Croatia in its historical borders. Right. And that he had a diplomatic passport for Jordan. He had a diplomatic passport because he actually worked in the Jordanian embassy in Germany during his time in the 50s. He also studied in university in Germany at the time as well, under a relatively famous...
Did he study medicine?
No, he did not. Law, but with a focus on Islamic law.
Law and a focus on Islamic law.
Something makes sense for him. So, he had this already connection in Germany and Switzerland. By 1957, the CIA had made it an official priority to extend their reach to the Muslim world and start doing, some serious organizing. And they sent an agent by the name of Robert Dreyer, not to be confused with Rod Dreyer.
Rob Dreyer.
Rob Dreyer. In 1957 to take control of Amcom-Lib's office in Munich and start doing some, real organizing with Muslims, and particularly with Saeed Ramadan and the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So a year later, 1958, Ramadan was allowed to settle in West Germany and was kind of given this objective to take control of the Munich Muslim community and put it in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood and as such, the CIA as well.
Okay.
Again, this is something that we can't go into too many details about. There's a whole book by this journalist Ian Johnson called Mosque in Munich, which is all about this. So if you're interested, you can read that. I used it a bit for the research in this book again. So back to Muftić. What does this all have to do with him?
Because he's everywhere. Because he has to be in the middle of this.
Right, but like I said at the top of the episode, it's no coincidence that Muftić's path follows Ramadan's, right? So Ramadan gets himself established in Germany, he lives in Switzerland, all this kind of stuff. And then, Muftić does as well. He follows his brother-in-law. And, Ramadan's involvement, the CIA in West Germany, like Ramadan's involvement with the CIA and West Germany in general, did open the doors to a lot of Muslim Brotherhood refugees to come from countries in which they were being outlawed to come settle in Germany. So Muftić is by no means some sort of exception there. It's not that he was such an important CIA asset that he was, allowed to follow Ramadan. No, there were a lot of guys that were coming to West Germany at the time, right, from the Middle East, who were, political refugees. But, it's clear, at least to me, that Muftić's connections high up in the Brotherhood put him in a very good position to be an asset as well. Mm-hmm. And the extent of his cooperation and contact with AMCOM-Lib, specifically in the CIA in general, isn't super well known. He is listed as a member of the German Muslim League in the 1960s, where he possibly could have served as a bridge between the Brotherhood, which he was representing, and these more old school SS guys, from von Mende in the BND's camp, right? Because he's in both worlds, right? He is a Muslim Brotherhood guy close to Ramadan, but also a former SS soldier. And a member of, a fascist emigre organization is very much, still representing that whole world as well. So, him being a member of the German Muslim League at the time is probably pretty significant, and probably hints at some of, again, these accusations that he was working for the German government as well. So, like I was saying, any kind of official record of Muftić's cooperation or, employment for AMCOM-Lib isn't very well established. I'm inclined to believe that it was definitely there. Like some of his activities, such as serving as Ramadan's delegate to the World Muslim Congress in 1962, probably point to some CIA involvement because they were funding pretty much all of Ramadan's travel at the time. He was, traveling extensively, organizing conferences, doing all this stuff, and this was all paid for by the CIA. But it's actually in his writings that I came up with, during my research, that I can see a pretty direct link to AMCOM-Lib, and thus, also the CIA. As I've said before, not much has been written about Muftić in general.
Yeah.
and even less from some sort of kind of more objective perspective. But the writings that I found in my research that Muftić wrote in pro-Ustasha newspapers under his pen name Firuz the Younger suggest a connection to AMCOM-Lib. And so a lot of the articles that he wrote, most of which were written at the height of Ramadan's involvement with the CIA, are almost taken word for word from AMCOM-Lib's book. Huh. So for example, in 1962, which is the year that he moved to Germany, in the Chicago-based pro-Ustasha newspaper Danica, he wrote a long article detailing the plight of Muslims in the Soviet Union. This is kind of unusual for Ustasha newspapers at the time. They tend to focus mostly on Yugoslavia, right?
Sure.
A little bit here and there on just kind of general anti-communism, but this is, a very large article, spanning multiple pages about the suffering of Muslims in the USSR. And aside from a few paragraphs in the beginning where he kind of puts it in some sort of Yugoslav context and says something about how, the Ustashas knew the danger of communism early on and all this kind of stuff. The rest of it is just straight up Amcomlib stuff. Like word for word.
Easiest job he's ever had.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. He probably wasn't paid for that, but this is him doing a thing, which is, pushing CIA propaganda and other emigre newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, his articles about India and things like the non-aligned movement line up very well with the U.S. government anti-colonial discourse at the time. It is this hybrid of both being Muslim Brotherhood stuff, Muslim Brotherhood positions, in that, like, when he talks about India, for example, he does for Yugoslavs also kind of make it into India's, this multinational country. It's kind of like Yugoslavia in the sense it doesn't have a real kind of quasi-commie, but that, like, the problem is that India, from a Muslim Brotherhood perspective, is also run by Hindus who will never respect Muslims because they have a caste system. And Pakistan is far superior because Islam abolishes the caste system. It shows that he doesn't actually know much about how Islam functions in South Asia, but but nevertheless, this is that kind of thing. And, this again lines up very much with what the CIA was trying to do at the Bandung conference in Indonesia, it's a kind of predecessor to the non-aligned movement, meeting of a lot of newly independent countries of Asia, particularly where the U.S. sent delegates and the CIA sent delegates to kind of try to steer the conversation more in this anti-communist way. They had some success in the first one and none in the second one. But again, his writings really kind of reflect that. When he talks about Algeria too, it's very similar, right? It's good to get rid of French colonialism, but not good to be secular and quasi-communist. Right. He even writes about, like, the Kurdish question, for example. It's kind of interesting. Also in the 60s, where he's rejecting the secular nationalisms of like Persia and Iraq, and more of in favor of what, like, the Muslim Brotherhood was promoting at the time. So I don't know. Like, at least from his writings, it seems to me that he was doing some Amcomlib stuff. But, like, if that wasn't enough to establish his connection with, like, the CIA, the other organization that he was working with, which is a very bizarre CIA U.S. intelligence front organization that we kind of just really have to talk about quickly. And that is a group called Jamiat al-Islam. So according to Ian Johnson, at least I've seen this elsewhere, Muftić was employed from this by this organization for some time, and it has very interesting roots. So Jamiat al-Islam was the only U.S. Jamiat al-Islam was the only Islamic charity organization that was officially registered and based out of the United States in the 1950s and 60s. Although by their own estimation, they've existed for far longer, but we'll get into why this is weird.
It just means
not true.
It just means Islamic society, right, or something like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so on paper, they were a charity organization that had existed for centuries, and even in the old world, and then they came and
like a vacuum.
Yeah. It was run by an eccentric, let's say it that way, novelist, writer by the name of Ahmad Kamal. And according to his official biography, that you can even find now if you look up some of his books on Amazon, I'll just read his biography to you.
Okay.
Ahmad Kamal was born on a Colorado Indian Reservation in 1914 of Turco-Tatar parents who were forced into exile by the Tsar for participation in the 1905 revolution. Kamal's genetic makeup imprinted all of his endeavors, be they as deep-sea diver, combat pilot, horseman, warrior, and as an exponent of national self-determination.
The Turkic-Tatar deep-sea divers. Forgot all about them.
Horseman, combat pilot.
Yeah, okay.
He commanded the Basmachi rebellion in Turkestan in the 1920s and 30s and supported the independence of Indonesia and Algeria, and was commanding general of the Muslim Liberation Forces of the Union of Burma.
Whoa.
He devoted his entire life to the independence of his fatherland from Russian and Chinese yokes. He died a month short of the collapse of the USSR. Blah, 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 blah. So.
Quite a fella.
Quite a fella, except that this guy's basically some sort of Muslim Rachel Dolezal of the time period. So according to Johnson...
I bet he knew nothing of falconry.
Yeah. Not from his childhood, at least. So according to Johnson, who found his FBI record or whatever, he was actually born in a wealthy suburb of Denver.
Nice.
As Cimarron Hathaway to parents James Worth Hathaway and Caroline Hathaway.
James Worth Hathaway, famous, dreaded Tatar general.
So not Ahmad Kamal. He would frequently revise his own biography. He would call his father Kara Yusuf. He said later, I think, probably when he got called out on the fact of not actually being Tatar, that his dad's actually a stepdad. His mom married a much older Tatar man who was then, killed went back to fight for liberation of his homeland. Then, of course, he commanded the Basmachi rebellion. It's not historically in any way possible, given that he was born in 1914 and the rebellion was over. So none of this is true. So this is the kind of guy that we're dealing with here. This is who Muftić was working for. It kind of makes sense in some weird way.
Yeah.
It'll make more sense.
Mahmut Muftic, MD, you mean?
MD, exactly.
Yes, totally legit and real medical doctor.
So he was actually a pretty, not celebrated, but, had decent success as a novelist. For some time, he wrote a lot of kind of adventure novels where he worked his own character into them, like his own Ahmad Kamal character, which is
great.
Probably maybe where some of this deep sea diver, horseman, combat pilot stuff comes in. Because from what I can tell, that's not real.
It sounds pretty awesome, though. I mean,
yes,
sounds all right.
He did actually convert to Islam in his youth, though, so that's not a complete lie. He was a Muslim. He did eventually change his name to Ahmad Kamal. But, he claims that during World War II, he was in East Turkestan in China, Xinjiang, where he was organizing fighters and got captured by the Japanese and got released at the end of the war. Again, not really clear if any of that is true or how much of that is true. Nevertheless, Jamiat al-Islam did become a real organization. And, they did even, for example, engage in polemics with, the Nation of Islam, where they, said Elijah Muhammad wasn't a real Muslim and all this other kind of stuff. So it did exist. It wasn't necessarily maybe set up by the CIA.
I mean, it's interesting that they're saying that Elijah Muhammad is not a real Muslim and this is their guy.
Yeah,
right.
Just described.
Yeah. Cimarron Hathaway.
Yes.
I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it. Cimarron?
I'd never heard that name before.
Cimarron.
Arron?
Yeah.
Sounds like a delicious Mexican snack.
It does. Or like
Chimarrón.
an old-timey guy name.
Yeah.
It's the kind of name that CIA guys have, no?
Hey, it's true. It's true.
But what is relatively clear is that, Jamiat al-Islam was funded by the CIA after World War II, and that Ahmad Kamal was being sent kind of all over the world. So he claims to have, and this seems to be true that he was based in Indonesia for a while and did, for example, attend the Bandung conference. But in general, was he based in Indonesia or not? Seems that he probably was. But with all of their activities, the details of it are very, very sketchy. And I think that Muftić's involvement in this organization might have led to some of the more spectacular claims of him being like an arms smuggler and Mossad agent. The organization claims that before the war, at some point in their existence, they had set up their own mining operations in Africa for precious metals, and that's where they got all their money. But in reality, it was actually the CIA. Although they may have, who knows? Nobody knows. A lot of their CIA files are still sealed, and his name's been erased from a lot of things. They were alleged to have been funding anti-Muslim militant groups from everywhere from Indonesia all the way to North Africa and Palestine. Some of that seems to be real. One thing is for certain is that they had a contract from the U.S. government for the U.S. Escapee program, which we've talked about before, I believe back when we talked about collaborationists moving to the United States. Because it was a program specifically in place to, bring anti-communist refugees to America. Although I guess they got rather late to the game and then got in trouble with the U.S. government for scamming them, cooking the books and declaring that they were bringing more refugees than they actually were, and taking much money, and they got their funding cut off by at least that department for some period of time. Interestingly enough, though, Muftić wasn't the only Bosniak former SS soldier in the group. So their one-time head of their European section was a guy by the name of Ahmed Balagia, who was another member of the Hamjar division, who emigrated to the U.S. after the war and got citizenship there before returning to Europe to network with other Bosnian refugees. And I'm not sure whether or not he was Muftić's link to Jamiat al-Islam, because it's quite possible that they knew each other from before. This guy, Ahmed Balagia, was also involved in certain Croatian circles in the U.S. when he was there. So there's a good chance that they had some sort of relationship before, but they did both work for Jamiat al-Islam. But when I did some more research on that, it's interesting that the Jamiat al-Islam was very obviously a CIA front to a lot of people. In a book by this Bosniak scholar Mustafa Imamović, representatives of Jamiat al-Islam attempted to make links with Bosniak emigres in Vienna in the 60s, and all of them were immediately suspicious of them and quickly called them out as being a front for the U.S. government and spies. And it kind of comes from, the typical thing, and these guys were actually smart enough to identify it, is that, Jamiat al-Islam comes, meets a bunch of these Bosnian guys and says, hey, guys, we want to set up an Islamic center here in Vienna, and we have basically unlimited funding to do so.
Yeah.
And most of these guys were like, no, fuck off. Except for, according to Imamović, this guy, Ahmed Balagia, who immediately joined ranks. But maybe he wanted that sweet CIA money.
Sure. We've seen it before on this show.
And then, of course, some of these guys in Vienna were like, hey, there's some, there are Muslim refugees here, from Yugoslavia that have like real needs. They don't have money for heating, and, can you help us out? And they were like, no. Which, would raise some red flags if you're a charitable organization. We don't have charity, but we want you to establish this, Islamic center here in Vienna and take our money.
Yeah.
And this actually, they were controversial for many reasons. And one of them is that the guys that, a lot of these Jamiat al-Islam guys that got involved in the Munich Mosque project they kind of went rogue and started trying to take it over from the rest of the CIA and the Muslim Brotherhood. Got kind of caught up with that, and then felt the brunt of both the CIA and the BND's wrath after that. But one when I mentioned the Muftić's allegation of arms smuggling and the Mossad thing, again, I think it likely comes from Jamiat al-Islam because they got involved with some controversies as well. They were accused of gun running and kind of beyond what the CIA wanted them to do, of sending money and weapons to various different militant groups in North Africa specifically. Some in Algeria, and like I said last episode, this is where Muftić in the book that I read by Mustafa Imamović was accused by all these Bosniak nationalists of weapons smuggling, right? Mm-hmm. And that to me seems largely to be from probably this involvement with Jamiat al-Islam and also the Mossad connection too, because for a time period they had an office in Jerusalem as well. And they got into a fight with the Jordanian government at some point, who accused them of then working for the Mossad.
Okay.
And so that's probably where that rumor of Muftić's Mossad involvement comes as well.
I see.
Although that seemed to be pure politics and actually not really based on any kind of association that Jamiat al-Islam had with the Mossad.
Yeah.
But,
it sounds unlikely.
Israel. Makes sense. So, I mean, that's kind of a interesting link of his to a very sketchy organization. And it makes a lot of sense for what we know about him, right?
Yes.
He seems to be like this kind of fraud and huckster, and him being associated with this kind of organization that is also CIA funded makes a lot of sense to me.
I think he'd prefer to call himself a jack of all trades, a Renaissance man, if you will.
Yeah. Most of
one hand in
hypnotist.
Yeah, I was going to say one hand in CIA Middle Eastern geopolitical strategy, and another hand, up the anus of some hypnotized Basran surgery patient. Yeah, trying to figure out where his Muftić is.
So what does it all mean?
Wow, bold start to this conclusion. I don't think I would ever be brave enough to tease our listeners with a sentence like that.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say because, I'm very intrigued by his character, and I'm trying, to piece together all these different connections that he has, which are really vast and strange. And of course, his career comes to an end with his mysterious death in 1971. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. We've talked a lot about emigre groups over this arc, but I think very few of them have had this kind of extensive connection to Western intelligence as Muftić and other intelligence agencies. I didn't mention the British connection there too. I did look into why Luburić said he was an MI6 agent. And it might come from either his extensive support for the, Scottish League for European Freedom, which is an essential part of the Anti-Bolshevik League of Nations, which was an MI6, largely at some point an MI6 funded operation in the early days. He wrote an obituary for the guy who was the head of that, whose name I cannot remember, some generic ass, name, in one of these Ustasha newspapers. So maybe that's what they were thinking of. He did write other kind of anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations support stuff, about Bandera and his assassination and the like. So maybe that's his connection to MI6. Of course, he lives in the UK at the end of his life. So
did he say that Kavaja and the Serbs did it?
No, he didn't. He said that the Soviets did it and that we have to be aware, because this is when he's still on his let's AMCOM lib, focus on the Soviet Union kind of thing. Because he's like, the Soviets are all around us, and, kind of don't buy the, Tito Stalin split thing either. Commies a commie and they're going to kill you. And of course, we heard these stories that, Yugoslav secret police attempted an assassination on him as well. The question is, he is very well connected to in some way or another to Western intelligence, specifically the CIA, right? Through
Yeah.
multiple different organizations and multiple different connections, both in his political work and his hypnosis work. And what difference does that make? I don't know. Does that mean that, the CIA had, for example, infiltrated Croatian National Resistance? What was their relationship in terms of their highly illegal, crazy activities? Right? We don't know because a lot of that stuff hasn't been released. Could things have gone differently? And this is something that, I mentioned last week too. If Muftić had, he seems to have been better connected and had the relationship that all these guys, that these Ustaša guys wanted in the early days, right? They wanted to work for the CIA. They wanted to work for the Western governments. They wanted support internationally. And Muftić seemed to have, in some way or another, done all of that. Now, whether or not he was a super serious player in any of these, organizations is anyone's guess, right? Like, how close was he to get the Saudis to, recognize Croatia? How much of an asset was he for the CIA? How much was he doing for AMCOM-Lib? What's the MK Ultra connection? What would it have made a difference one way or another? And I'm not really sure.
Well, it probably helps that he wasn't such a big shot because, otherwise, like, if he goes to, Saudi Arabia to try to seek support for Croatian National Resistance, he'd be met with, Muftić, the hypnotism guy, the aura guy, Like, I think it helps that if you're just under the radar, you can wear a lot of hats.
Well, they didn't have the internet back then. I don't think the Saudis would have even necessarily known about that because they weren't reading his, publications put out by the British Metaphysical Society or whatever.
That's what I'm saying. If he made it big in one of these circles, it'd be harder to, operate as freely in these other circles, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And so,
he would have to call himself, Anton Muftić or something like that. His other stuff.
Mahmut the Mysterious.
Yes. Firuz the Younger. He did have several aliases that he went under. There are a few more, too, that I can't remember offhand. But, he did have many different personalities and aliases and seemingly many different allegiances. And, to be honest, again, I don't know how significant that is to any of these organizations that we mentioned. I think that if his connections in the Middle East were real and, he had become the head of Croatian National Resistance and, headed a Islamic Croatian government in exile, that would have been something to contend with. But for now, I'd say, it's an interesting story, if nothing else.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's helpful, too, because, as he moves around the world, he also draws the outline of the CIA so we could color it in with other people,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, without him, we wouldn't have been able to talk about Ahmad Kamal or Cimarron Hathaway, which I very much wanted to include in this episode and was delighted when I found out that he was actually connected to that and that there was another Balkan connection to that organization as well.
Yeah.
Because that's some weird shit.
It all makes me appreciate also how real and committed Azam al-Amriki was, the metalhead back in our first arc to this world. Because, now that I see all these hucksters and people moving around like this and changing their titles and expertise, he kept it real. His expertise was metal and jihad. And
he did, and he died by the drone.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
Muftić might have died by the poison. We don't know. I don't actually know if he was poisoned or not. Nobody does.
Yeah, there's no way to ever know.
So just another layer of mystery to that story.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess this is it for him for now, except that in Patreon, we're going to be talking more kind of broadly.
A little bit. Yeah.
He'll come up again there.
We'll be
Aura stuff, right?
Aura stuff. Yeah, we're opening the next episode with his researches in Aura. And again, like we do with all Muftić related items, we'll take it somewhere else and fill it in with other people.
Yeah.
He's our connective tissue.
Yeah.
This is some Ustaša oral history.
Don't make oral history a real thing. All right,
I'm sure you're not the first person to say that.
No, it's David used to say that. Fucking Maya.
David Myatt.
Right. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, when he would refuse to say oral history.
That's right.
And say oral history. So we're actually going to do an oral history. Thanks a lot, Ray, for pointing that out. All right.
I think we've definitively also closed the book on Croatian national resistance. And
word.
For it. Yeah.
All right. Oof, long journey.
Yeah.
Bad people.
All right. Indeed. Well, see y'all next week.
Next week.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.